Let's get some analysis now on that and other stories relating to the United States with James Brown. He's a non-resident fellow at the US Studies Centre, Chief Executive of the Australian Space Industry Association as well. James, thanks for your time. What are the implications of this latest standoff in Congress for Biden's own legislative agenda?
It's problematic. I mean, Biden has put sweeping bills up, enormous amounts of spending across a number of areas, including social security, climate change, infrastructure. This threatens that agenda. So the president cancelled some travel he had planned this week so that he could stay back and negotiate with not only his own party, but the Republicans as well. It puts his agenda at risk. And for someone who has really spent so long and can claim to have a record of seeking compromise in Congress, for him to fail here would be quite damaging for his further legislative agenda.
Yeah, well, that was one of the things that we had heard so much about in the election period, that he was so experienced in Congress and dealing with both sides of the aisle, that he'd be able to unite. At the moment, it seems just another example of many that we've seen in recent decades of stalemate.
He's trying to thread a needle here. I mean, he's wedged by those members of his party, particularly in the Senate, who come from areas where they have razor-thin margins, in West Virginia and Arizona, where they could very easily lose the next time they go around if they're not shown to be more restrained in their spending and in what they're willing to approve. Progressives who aren't going to compromise on what they see as critical funding for climate change. And then, of course, a Republican minority in the Senate where you're locked at 50-50, and you only need one objection to trigger the filibuster process, which would stop this bill that's going up to the Senate tonight to lift the debt ceiling. I mean, the consequences of not lifting the debt ceiling are significant, and the Treasury Secretary warned on those on Tuesday. Amongst other things, borrowing costs would go up for the US economy and for US borrowers. Already they've had to make changes to superannuation investments for postal workers and government workers. But most importantly, it would be a huge blow to US financial and economic prestige if they were to default on their loans because Congress couldn't reach an outcome.
James, on the Afghanistan hearing, I know you've been watching this one closely. What have you made of some of the revelations, including criticism from the top brass when it comes to both the current and former president's decisions?
Yeah, I think it's been fascinating watching General Marley's testimony over the last couple of weeks, not just because of some of those comments that were made about steps he took in the last days of the Trump presidency, but it's quite clear that there were enough warnings on the consequences of a rapid pullout. And there were some bad decisions made, particularly around how to secure Kabul. And really neither President Biden or President Trump have covered themselves in any glory here. This will continue to drag out. Miley's position, I think, is very interesting. The more scrutiny he faces as a result of those comments in Bob Woodward's latest books, I think the more challenging it will be for him to be effective in his position. But certainly none of this coming out is good for the State Department particularly. I think it points to just how run down the State Department had become and how poorly prepared it was to manage this transition.
Yeah, indeed. It has been quite damning on that front. On a brighter note, certainly for the Prime Minister and his relations with the United States, you had the meeting last week, the Quad, off the back of the AUKUS agreement. How have things, we look at the wash-up of all of that, still some criticism from Europe, particularly France. What's your take on how all of this has landed for the Prime Minister?
Look, I think it's been a very significant week for the Prime Minister, and it's quite an achievement to do what he's done in terms of the AUKUS agreement. There's been plenty of criticism of it from a range of former Prime Ministers this week, but this just shows you that I think some of the stable assumptions of our foreign policy are being re-examined from first principles. I think some of the criticisms of Australia trading away its sovereignty are completely overblown. I mean, the fact that the Quad partners are at the table and at the table in such significant ways, the kind of cooperation they're laying out in space, in cyber, or on maritime issues, statements that never would have been made 5 years ago, just goes to show that there is a consensus across those countries between leaders of different political persuasions. The only way to manage China now is to show strength and to push back against Chinese bullying and coercion. So I think the Prime Minister has had a good week for Australia. Of course, there's an enormous amount of detail to be fleshed out now, and there'll be bureaucracies in Canberra and Washington and London and Delhi and Tokyo, for that matter, scrambling to fill in the blanks. I mean, talking to US colleagues in the space world this week, they know that we're going to be doing a lot more on defence issues in space between the US, the UK and Australia, but they don't know what that is. There's a lot of detail to be filled in.
And I mean, just finally, we're almost out of time, but this agreement, it comes off a pretty high base. If you look at the military relationship, you know, the F-35 fighter jets, we have more of those than any other country outside the United States, for example.
Look, Australia has always relied on other partners. I mean, during the Second World War, we had almost no submarine force at all and had to rely on other partners, including the Dutch, to provide for our maritime security. So it's not a surprise. The question, I think, goes to how much do we want to be willing to do on our own? What are those absolute critical sovereign components, whether it's parts of our military or parts of our defence industry, infrastructure and national capability base? Those questions are being asked at the moment in a detailed way. The reality is all of this is happening because our part of the world particularly is not becoming a safer place. It's becoming a more concerning place. There's less certainty about what will happen, and that's why you're seeing countries band together to navigate that.
James Brown, thank you for your time and analysis as always. I'll talk to you soon.